So greetings and welcome to today's educational program. Managing for Quality Lecture Series number 17, Quality as a Political Policy by Dr. Gregory H. Watson. This is your moderator, Doug Wood, with ASQ's Quality Management Division. So today we have the distinct pleasure of hearing from Dr. Gregory H. Watson. Join me in welcoming him. Dr. Watson has degrees in management, law, and industrial engineering. He's an 18-year ASQ veteran, 18-year ASQ fellow and past chair from 2000. In 2020, Dr. Watson was elected as an honorary member of ASQ, its highest honor. Previously, he's received the ASQ Distinguished Service Medal, plus the Lancaster, Crosby, and Ishikawa medals. He's been named an honorary member by 19 other national quality associations. Dr. Watson has been a frequent speaker at ASQ national and divisional conferences, twice for the Quality Management Division. And he's delivered this webinar series for QMD since early 2020. He's a former quality executive with Hewlett-Packard, Compaq Computer, Xerox, and he has coached executives in quality transformations at Nokia Mobile Phones and Toshiba, ExxonMobil, and over 20 other companies. Dr. Watson is the only Westerner to have been awarded the Deming Medal by the Union of Japanese Scientists and Engineers, the W. Edwards Deming Award for Dissemination and Promotion Overseas in 2009. And so without more ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Gregory H. Watson. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doug. You got that introduction down just pat right now. Well, tonight we're going to talk about quality as a political policy. We've been through 12 lectures talking about managing for quality, and now we're in a series of 6 lectures that are broadening out quality in what I call macro quality, or the application beyond the corporation into society. And so it's natural then to ask this question that what is quality as a political policy? Now, to begin this, let's review what we mean by quality. So what we mean by quality is the relentless pursuit of goodness, coupled tightly with the persistent avoidance of badness. This is what we would call a transcendental definition. In other words, it's philosophical. And from this definition, we have to make it particular to every organization that we're dealing with, based on the deliverables of that organization, the relationships it has with its variety of stakeholders, and then how it's going to fit into society. And when we take a look, there are some core principles of quality that we have to interpret in a social situation. So one is respect for people in their diversity of race, religion, and nationality. We have to respect scientific gains of those who walked before us. We have to protect the environment, which sustains all of us. We have to abstain from all intentional wrongdoing and harm. And we have to practice 2 things in all of our activities. Either we're going to help or we do no harm. So our question is going to be, what is good for the common good, and also what is bad? So let's now review some definitions that will get us into this concept of political policy. First, what do we mean by sociology? So if we talk about a social setting, we have to study the way a group of individuals or groups of individuals form a society and how their human behavior operates together. What are their interpersonal interactions? How do they form a culture or a way of being? And what sociological studies do is they combine empirical research, taking a look at connectivity and relationships, and critical analysis into a body of knowledge about social order and its mechanisms for managing change. And what we see in this graphic are 2 social systems. Social system 1 on the left and social system 2 on the right. And these are like global networks. We see that the individual is connected inside of social system 1. And through some very complex network, social system 1 is connected also to social system 2. Individual 1 that we're talking about is connected to both of these social systems, but they might not even see what that connectivity is. But what we see is sociology is interpreting the meaning of social actions and explains the way actions work and the effect it produces. That's a quote from Max Weber. Max Weber was one of the founders of social thinking back in the last century. What do we mean by social science then? The social science is a branch of science devoted to study societies and the relationships that exist between individuals in those societies. It encompasses a lot of different disciplines. So there's anthropology, study of human forms and where we came from, linguistics, to study how we speak, archeology, the way we lived, human geography, where people migrated around Earth, economics, our financials, history, how we had the history, as well as psychology, about how we think and work. So there's an implied conditional relationship that exists between two different categories of people. We see one category are progressives, and progressive means someone who is seeking change. And the other category is traditionalists, and these are those who are resisting change. And what we see is that there tends to be some knowledge beyond a philosophical, theological perspective of meaning about the nature of life and the purpose of human interrelationships. But what we see is that there's no real grand theory that describes the system of the relationships between progressives and traditionalists. And natural scientists seek to develop general laws through experimentation, but the humanists can't do that. So they study traditions to understand what are the particulars about these relationships. And as Aristotle said, around 380 BC, man is a political animal. And he talked about that in his book called Politics. Now, what do we mean by a social system? Well, we see we can have local networks. And these are individuals connected through interrelationships in a way that defines the social linkages. And if you've had the LinkedIn, for instance, you can see what is your social linkage at the first, second, and third level or nodes that are away from your description of how you relate to people. And we see that today, these artificial societies are established through social networks like Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter. And social systems are unique. Each possesses its own culture or moral code. So we can see different families have different ways of working, different communities, different cities, tribes, colleges, nations, industries, corporations, and any identifiable gathering of people for a common purpose or a shared objective. And so as we start seeing, those social networks can be tightly coupled, as we see in this circle here in red, where everybody is very tightly coupled. Or they can be loosely coupled, as we see in this circle in green. So the coupling effect is talking basically about how tightly you understand your direct relationships with everyone upon it. And we see that networks may be open, public, or closed, private. So there's many different ways to describe these networks that mean our social system. Now, when we talk about politics, we see politics reflects many different choices that are desirable to society as a whole. And they refine the future that the composite group represented by the politicians will pursue for their common good. So when we're talking about this, what we see is that politics involves the nature of governing and the means to achieve common social goals. Now, when we talk about political, we see, well, we humans, we tend to agree and disagree about a lot of things. Perhaps we disagree about more than we agree. But we disagree about the aims, the purpose, or the objectives of government. We also disagree about the methods and programs that have to be enacted to achieve those ends. So a particular choice or perspective to pursue to achieve the desired objective is what we're going to be calling a policy. So political choice is inherently partial. It's going to reflect one of those perspectives. Either it's going to be progressive or it's going to be traditional. And it's reflecting policies and implementation plans that are going to be consistent with that perspective, which is roughly shared by a coherent group. And we see that a group maintains a common way of interpreting their philosophy of democracy, the meaning of law, and the perspectives on efficiency and operations of governing institutions and the supporting structure. The political typically refers to an approach taken on matters of public choice to force others to obey the will of one party or another. As Henry L. Mencken once said, democracy is a pathetic belief in the collective wisdom of individual ignorance. And sometimes we feel that, and it's always the other political party that seems to be ignorant. So, what do we mean by political science? Well, political science is studying the means by which people organize their social systems to achieve that set of values that they're looking for. So political theory is concerned with the way political communities and their institutions operate. It focuses on human nature and the moral purpose for the groups to associate with each other. What makes it science? Well, Aristotle said in his Politics that politics is a master science as it discusses matters of the state. But today, this doesn't qualify anything as a science. Science is a systematic study of some phenomena. But politics is not the same as chemistry or physics. And there is some continuity in considering the past and current viewpoints about administrative of the state, but those are subjective and susceptible to objective study in some way. But what we see is political science dynamically observes the way communities act and think, which progressively changes over time. Observational data captures the experience and the way of life of socialized people. So what we see is that the aim of humanity almost always is a false front for an urge to rule over others. And so we see this policy, if you will, is a course of action chosen among alternatives to guide directions of organization by means of law, regulation, procedure, administrative action, incentive, or voluntary practice as defined by government, an institution, or a political party. So policy decisions define a set of priorities, and they're implemented as a strategic plan, and they're allowed to allocate resources according to some time-phased plan for implementing that action. James Adams, one of the founders of the Constitution, said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious purpose. It's totally inadequate or wholly inadequate to the government of any other kind of people." And so we see that government policy is actually a political statement of strategic intent. And as Mencken said, under democracy, one party always devotes its chief energies to trying to prove that the other party is unfit to rule. And both commonly succeed, and both parties are right. So party is a choice by a ruling party that it's imposing on everybody else. And when they're no longer in power, the other party imposes its will. And we see that this is the way we have, if you will, the tradition occurring in the political domain. Now, policy making is actually a process. First, we design the policy, it's collaborative government. Then we implement it. We can understand what's going on with behavioral economics. We evaluate it, and there we have to understand citizen science. And we have to have open data so we can analyze the problem, make it visual, and then we can model that policy. The idea of policy making is that we should be putting the citizens first. So how do these advanced analytics support policy? Well, collaborative governance means prototyping developments online so it leverages knowledge and participation of citizens to improve public policies and services. It's called open design for execution of government. And we see that of these, behavioral economics moves beyond the traditional carrots, public funding, and sticks, regulation, to deliver policy objective using experiments to nudge or encourage positive behavioral action. We see citizen science is enabling every citizen to become a voluntary data source to real-time apps and using Internet of Things types of sensors. So we can see what the response is of citizens to various types of policy. Open government data allows transparency to build services at scale, so we move from experiment to scale, and to hold government officials accountable for their actions in implementation of the policy. Visual analytics increases the accessibility of data. So it's not everybody who understands statistics, but people can understand the pictures about it, and encourages a mass of citizens to become aware of what we in quality accept as evidence-based decisions. Policy modeling is simulating policy decisions, highlighting using the interactions of multiple agents in a system, as opposed to using the independent actions of rational human beings. Because people don't always act rationally in that system, but they do act in a probabilistic way. But as we see here, then this Lisbon Council in 2015 on the telecommunications tools used for government policymaking, they say sophisticated tools are no substitute for having functional institutions, well-designed processes, and high-quality reference data. That's got to sound like something that we in quality can get our teeth into. So what is the nature of political policy? Well, this is public policy development and deployment and it follows a process that's similar to most of our problem-solving methods. While public policies are based on laws and implementing regulations, others can become involved in funding, resource allocation, review, and by a variety of government agencies or levels of judicial oversight. So the process follows a series of 6 steps. We recognize the problem, we set an agenda for change, we formulate the policy, what we're going to do. We adopt that policy, we implement it, and then we evaluate it. At each step along the way, there's an opportunity for conflict to erupt between opposing parties. And thus, even if a policy is enacted into law, there is no guarantee it will be executed as originally intended in the law. And this can lead to lots of frustrations by people who believe once we have a law, it's going to mean something. But Plato made this comment. He said, one penalty for refusing participation in politics is you end up being governed by your inferiors. Many of us do not wish to be involved in politics. We think it's dirty, or we think it's somehow, only stupid people actually get involved in that. I have better things to do with my life. But then the problem is that people who do not think well, people who do not understand quality as a way of life, end up governing us and imposing on us their will. So what does quality bring to politics? So the global quality movement has evolved over the past century to the point where it has a set of universally accepted principles that are applicable to the world of politics and would prove useful to be applied for governance of nations as well as all organizations. And what we see is that some of these are put the customers or the citizens first. That means aim for inclusive democracy. Manage by process, assuring end-to-end systems flow and decision-making that's based on objective evidence. Management by fact, requiring objectivity in presentation of alternatives for making informed decisions and delivering value to all constituents fairly. Continual improvement, designing systems and processes to work in acceptable ways as judged by their customers. And leadership by example, promoting quality with personal role models that demonstrate the reality of quality for society. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers and the author of the Declaration of Independence, said, "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only object of good governance." So we start seeing that we have this connectivity across different functions to achieve a particular purpose or objective as the prime outcome of all of these things. So Gerald Henrik, Geert Hofstede, who's a sociologist, made this comment: all societies are unequal, but some are even more unequal than others. And he went on, he said, collectivism stands for a society in which people from birth onwards are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, associations, if you will, which throughout the people's lifetime continues to protect them in exchange for their unquestioning loyalty. And if policy is the action plan for transformation of society to a new state of existence, then quality should be required in its outcome, which implies equitable goodness, no favoritism, and no badness. So quality in government implies impartial institutions exercising decision authority through rulemaking to equitably distribute benefits to society. And this is what's embedded in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I won't talk about those, I've talked about them before, but this is what I call macro quality. All goodness, no badness for all, everyone on planet Earth. Now, we come to the first part of our focused discussion on quality as political policy. And here the question is, can we discover how humanity can organize to create a shared agenda to achieve common goals that increase quality of life for all of humanity? So democracy is really a messy form of government. Democracy should deliver the greatest good for society while assuring protection of minority rights by the elected majority. However, what we see is there's 5 principles of democracy that ensure protected rights of citizens. So one is rule of law. That sets the boundaries between laws and regulations that secure and protect liberty. Individual rights, the principle all people are created equal and possess natural rights which can never be diminished or taken away. Consent of the government. Everyone agrees to abide by laws of the land, but also has a voice in the government which exists for the people and not the other way around. The people do not exist for the government. Representative government. Citizens vote for officials to represent them. If citizens are not represented justly, then the government officials distort democracy by working to their own agenda rather than one for the public good. And finally, there's a system of checks and balances. Free government branches prevent government from acting unjustly or corruptly by assuring accountability. Alexander Hamilton has said, "We are now forming a republican government. Real liberty is never found in the disposition or in the extremes of democracy. The despots cannot, kings cannot give you real liberty, and the extremes of democracy do not either. But it has to be in moderate governments. As Abraham Lincoln said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy, that reality is in the middle of this in a collectivist form of working together. If we take a look at the Statue of Liberty, we see that that becomes a symbol, if you will, a target for society of what liberty means. And on it is embedded these words by Emma Lazarus from the poem The New Colossus. It says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And I think this is an expression of what we mean by democracy. Now, policy orders how societies deal with change. And policy is a definitive decision about the institution and course for implementation to guide present and future actions. It focuses on how to best serve a nation or organization that it represents. So there's different types of policies in government. There's a foreign policy, how we relate to sovereign states or collections of states, like in treaties. There's an economic policy that defines trade and monetary policy for how our economy operates. There's a criminal justice policy, which is the rules that describe social behavior that's acceptable and unacceptable, or that should be punished. There's also a do-nothing policy. Matter of fact, in the late 1800s, there was even a do-nothing political party because it was trying to say, both of those extremes are so crazy. But this is the policy of inaction, where government ignores a situation and circumstances and just does not respond to it. So laws define long-term policies. Regulations enact a specific set of implementing conditions for those laws. And Robert Gascoigne, who's the Marquis de Salisbury, said, "There's no such thing as fixed policy, because policy, like all organic entities, is always in the making. It's dynamically changing." Now, I have a couple of slides here that are from an organization where my daughter is working, called TBWA / the Disruption Company. And they evaluate society, and they look for what are the cultural shifts affecting the way people live and work as a way to understand how is the future developing. And they call these things edges. The edges are rooted in human values that are recognizable through people's behaviors, and they lead to clear implications for what's happening in society. And they've identified over 40 of these edges, and some of them deal with chaos, like our anxiety, or do we have a wealth warfare, debates about our bodies, and so forth. There's also preservation. How do we manage and gain the past? There's advancement. How do we drive forward? Or identity, liberation, and rebirth are the major categories. And what we see is that edges are cultural changes that have scale and longevity. They must have sustained relevance globally, and they must continue to matter in the foreseeable future. But as Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, said, life can only be understood backwards. So we can see what those edges are, and we can understand where the shifts are happening. But we must live it forwards. And when we're living forwards, we're actually living in a world of probability, forecasting ahead in that uncertain future. What do we need to make that future operate? And so they have this comment. They said the transition from old to new world is looking more like a marathon than a sprint. So if we take a look at the old world, we think about traditional ways of doing quality. The new world, some will call it quality 4.0 or digitalization. And they say it's looking more like a marathon than it is a sprint. And their daily efforts to fight another day. We're closing in and we're closing down. The new decade will require wiser conservation of our mental energy and physical resources, deeper knowledge of our past, and agile innovation. It's time for hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. When preservation is a priority, brands or consistency in performance can help us shelter, build resilience, and secure the essentials. Now, political parties are like multifaceted brands. They embrace a variety of people with different cultural leanings and values. And the platform of a political party is really a statement of policy intent, what it will deliver as a value proposition for the future value of society. But platforms must appeal to their wide assortment of these wildly diverse constituencies that exist in a party. So there's room for ambiguity, disambiguation, vague and obtuse statements. And Stephen Covey said, it's funny about human beings. We tend to judge ourselves by our intentions, what we think we're going to do, but we judge other people by their actions, what they did. So if we want to preserve equity and disturb inequity, we have to understand what are the foundational principles to establish good policy. And so defining policy is a result of an organization's executive function. It's the role of the legislative function of government to establish laws for implementing policy, while the executive function defines regulations to implement these laws. So that's the ping pong of the checks and balances. The judicial branch then ensures that laws and regulations provide fairness and equity in the social context of the nation. So what makes an effective policy? Well, one, it focuses on a specific situation that greatly concerns society. We care. The policy is clearly stated, so it's understood by everyone, as this enables it to be enforced without ambiguity. It's clear in common language that everyone can understand. The policy is structured concisely, so it's readily accessible. It's not in thousands of pages of laws, but it's in clear, concise statements that can be boiled down so everyone can understand. The policy is consistent. It applies to all citizens in an equitable way. And finally, we see that if we look at these things, some of these policies will fundamentally change the way we work. Donald Berwick, who is a quality professional, actually, and he established the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, and he made this comment. He said, any healthcare funding plan that is just, equitable, civilized, and human must, he emphasized, must redistribute wealth from the richer among us to the poorer and the less fortunate. Excellent healthcare is, by definition, redistributional. And so we start seeing that this divide between the wealthy and the people who don't have money, the haves and the have-nots, if you will, it's going to be a major part of what we're doing. So can we learn from something like hoshin kanri? That what methods could we apply that will help us in terms of doing some better global planning? So if we look at policies for society, industry, and infrastructure, it's about what we do and how we work. And so we start taking a look. There's two different types of infrastructure. There's national infrastructure, roads and bridges, electrical power grids, communications networks like broadband, public educational system, national healthcare systems. And what we see is that systematic underinvestment in these infrastructure elements has a crippling and a limiting way in which the society can actually develop and it's able to grow and diversify. We also see that building infrastructure is actually building opportunities for people to develop in different ways. And we see that underinvestment in infrastructure is a necessary consequence of other decisions that we're going to spend money in other ways, and that undermines the economic future as that oversight disables both industrial and commercial growth. If we don't have good roads, we don't have good transportation, we don't have good education, basically organizations cannot grow because they need those things to grow. And Senator Warren said, infrastructure is the core ingredient in building a stronger, more robust future. And she has two speeches there on YouTube, which if you take a look at this, you can see what her feelings are on the matter. Now, the other set of policies is about human infrastructure. And here we see things like early childhood care, which we can see from psychological studies makes a very big difference about people's contribution to society. Affordable access to health care, and then how people feel about life and their ability to live. Disability and unemployment protection, This is sort of the lifeline to society when they're having troubles in work. Food security, job support, job transition, reskilling. So this is developing the nation's citizenry. So it becomes the renewable and sustainable resource that can contribute to the social circular economy through the process of innovation. But what we see is since 1990, the lowest 70% of the American population has seen a 0% increase in income. This is from the Congressional Budget Service, not from a political group. All the income increased experienced in a boom economy benefit those in the top 30% over the last 30 years. And it's Victoria Woodhull. You may not know her, but she was the first female candidate to run for U.S. presidency in 1872. And this is what she said in one of her speeches. It's not great wealth in a few individuals that proves the country is prosperous, but great wealth evenly distributed among the people. It is the struggling masses who are the foundation of this country. And if the foundation be rotten or insecure, the rest of the structure must eventually crumble. So it's time to think about mutual prosperity for humanity. When you read the book Principles of Scientific Management by Gregory, he says that the whole reason for scientific management is to create mutual prosperity between the workers and the organizations. But it never lived up to that promise. There was always a disequilibrium in the prosperity. So how does this work in terms of government perspectives? Well, hoshin kanri is an organization-wide strategy to achieve long-term vision or future of an organization. In 1993, the Government Performance Results Act, or GPRA, established a form of hoshin kanri for all federal agencies. The law still exists, but people do not follow its practice. They decided just to ignore parts of that. And Thomas Jefferson said, I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of people on the pretense of taking care of them. So are they actually wasting the labors of people, or are they really taking care of them? But we see government budgeting is basically a pay-as-you-go system, and it confuses something we see in industry, where it's actually using capital investment as an operating expense. It's paying for it in an annual budget, which is paid for by taxes. So an infrastructure is paid for with current tax revenue, not with bonds, not with long-term borrowing in terms of the bond system. It's backwards of how corporations actually fund their capital investments. And so we see that finding the future requires gaining agreement on policies or the intended future aims or purposes and goals or targets. It's a political conflict of interest when the parties both oppose each other. John Stuart Mill, this is in 1867, not 1967, said, bad men need do nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. So we have to take an action. If we in quality look for goodness and we want to drive society towards goodness, we need to do something. And one issue requires agreement on the message, one message. So Mahatma Gandhi was consistent in his work. He said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And this reminds me of a definition I had for strategy in 1993 in my book, Strategic Benchmarking, where I claim that strategy is the persistence of a vision. That's what Gandhi was looking at. And when we set priorities for a national agenda, how do we raise the constituency's issue to the national agenda level? Well, this depends on 6 factors to gain attention as a national priority. So first, how many citizens are affected, and what is their electoral voting activity? So who they vote for? What's the degree to which those constituents are organized? Do they achieve one voice? What are the resources available for funding political action? Are they persistent in pursuing that? Do they have meetings? Do they actually create their own infrastructure and communication channels? What's the presence of supportive congressional representation? Do they have congressmen's ear for different things that they want to move forward? What's the intensity and tenacity by which they promote their issue? Are they holding on and pursuing it consistently day in, day out? and what's the skill and communication savvy they have for promoting their cause. Thomas Jefferson said, "I sincerely believe banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, that a principle of standing money to be paid for by prosperity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. So if we keep kicking the can down the road and say, we'll pay for this in the future, we'll have this 10-year plan to pay it back, we actually are not paying it back. And influencing national priorities is almost impossible for individual citizens. They have to find ways to create a collaborative process. As Henry David Thoreau said, a minority is powerless while it conforms to the majority. Now, another person that is a role model here is Stephen Jobs. And he talked about the power of people to create momentum for change. And he said, my model for business is the Beatles. There were four guys who kept each other kind of negative tendencies in check. They balanced each other, and the total was greater than the sum of the parts. That's how I see business. Great things in business never are done by one person. They're done by a team of people. And when we implement something like hoshin kanri, it's a catch-ball situation. It requires strategic dialogue within and across all of the people who are affected by the decisions that are made for society. So now, the final part of this, I want to understand how quality thinking can integrate political agendas to achieve multiple benefits or mutual benefit for all global citizens. So first, we need to assure no one is left behind in anything. So what did we learn from our Managing for Quality webinars that applies to this political sphere of our world? Well, Jim taught us to pursue profound knowledge as a purpose in managing. And he identified four things. Appreciation of the system. Everything is interconnected. Variation in performance. There's variation in everything. We should not believe that things will go in a linear fashion without some form of variation. Theory of knowledge. We have to understand how the systems work, how it affects everything. And then psychological understanding. Collaboration requires trust among people. Duran taught us to combine breakthrough with continuing efforts to standardize, improve, control, and plan a better future. He taught about quality control, the ability to develop stability using standards. Quality improvement, constant attention to change is needed. Quality planning, futures must be planned to achieve goals. And Taguchi taught us that the greatest loss from bad quality occurs to the entire society, not to a corporation that delivered goods or services to the public. So we have to serve mutual interests, not special interests. We have to have one shared vision for the common good, for the world. Mutual prosperity means we have to achieve inclusive happiness. So quality must be apolitical, unconstrained, and preserving constancy of purpose for humanity. So a system is a network of interdependent components that work together to establish or accomplish the aim of that system. The system must have an aim. Without an aim, there is no purpose. The aim of the system must be clear to everyone in the system. The aim must include future plans for the future. The aim is a value adjustment. We must preserve the power of intrinsic motivation, dignity, cooperation, purity, curiosity, joy of learning that people are born with. Those were comments by Dr. W. Edwards Deming. John Kennedy said, let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us seek not to seek to fix the blame on the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future. Benjamin Disraeli, the first Israeli prime minister, said, the secret of success is constancy of purpose. So what do we mean when we talk about quality? We talk about quality for the future, what I'm calling macro quality. We're really talking about quality in a world that knows no boundaries. John F. Kennedy said, for the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. We think too much, Charlie Chaplin said. We feel too little. More than machines, we lived humanity. 1941 in a movie, The Great Dictator. So here are some takeaway lessons. And these come from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote The Origins of Inequality and The Social Contract, both which were documents that influenced our founding fathers. But he said, but in some great souls who consider themselves as citizens of the world and forcing the imaginary barriers that separate people from people. And this is what he said we need to be. We need to become those great souls. He said, in truth, laws are always useful to those with possessions and harmful to those who have nothing, from which it follows that the social state is advantageous to men only when all possess something and none has too much. So as we think about what this means, there's some takeaway comments here. So how should people work together to address the needs of humanity for a sustainable future for all mankind? Well, it could be said that politics is war by other means. It can be a form of class warfare between the haves, who are intent on preservation of their status, and the have-nots, who are merely intent on survival. And what I've tried to do in this webinar is to address three things. That humanity needs to create a shared change agenda. Hoshin kanri thinking can be applied in government for global planning, and that quality can be the integrating aspect for political agendas or national parties to achieve mutual benefits for all global citizens. The mandate, I believe, is macro quality delivers moral principles to serve for a democratic advancement of human dignity and sustainable life on Earth. So thank you very much for listening. Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we have some time for questions.
Indeed we do. Thank you, Dr. Watson. We've enjoyed this. This was quite, inspirational, I think. You could also say that it's somewhat controversial, some of the points that you made. We have some questions that pertain to that. So starting off here, fairly soft from Wally, says, how do you best form policies without introducing bureaucracy?
Well, bureaucracy is actually built into government, and that's why it's called bureau, and we used to call all the government departments bureaus. And bureaucracy can be either mechanistic, or which is what Max Weber talked about, and that means you just follow laws, or it can be humanistic. And so humanistic is saying that we interpret those laws in the light of the human beings and their moral rights. And so we have to be careful how we put government together. In 1993, I was seconded to the government when the initiative Reinventing Government was created. And we were trying to follow through with an initiative called Putting the Customer First, that meant the citizen. And to do that, we wanted to understand what were those things we could transfer from the private sector to the public sector, and how transferable were they. And we got some things done, but not many, because that bureaucracy was so efficient. And I think what the bureaucracy actually indicates to us is that any change in government is not going to be short-term. As Mencken in those comedian-like quotes that I said, it takes time to move the government. And if we don't have quality as an apolitical agenda, what that means is it goes on and off, if you will, as something we should do. And in the U.S., we can clearly see this. The Republicans started the Baltimore Wars. It went off when the Democrats came on and came back, and now it's sort of nowhere. And that's because there was no common intent to move forward with this. And I see that there are very different types of perspectives if you go to other countries. And I'm going to mention, I know this is probably going to be controversial, but China. So China has had a consistent national quality policy since 1997, renewed 3 times, and it is exactly defined how they're going to move the whole nation forward. So we have to figure out, how do we get this apolitical sense, so it's not of a party, but there's something good for all humanity in America.
Okay, thank you. One particular question criticizing your designation of healthcare and education as infrastructure from someone we both know. She says, healthcare and education are not infrastructure, they are systems within a culture. They are not bridges, they're not highways, they're not sewer systems. And she takes exception that you're quoting Elizabeth Warren. What do you have to say about that?
Well, everybody's entitled to their opinion. I'm not going to attack anybody, but actually there are social systems that are indeed systems that are infrastructure. Education exists as a system. We have schools that operate as school systems. And so they are different from hard systems or soft systems. Just like in business, we have manufacturing systems and we have human resource systems. So all systems can be either hard or soft. And we have to take a look at the systems engineer and recognize that. And yes, they are soft systems, but they're still systems.
Okay, so here's one from Ricardo. He says, how can a common agenda be agreed to amongst so many countries with different processes of governing, many countries having many political parties with different ideologies? How might that happen?
Well, I think that this is actually where I want to go with next week or the next month's lecture. And as we start to look, what are the agenda for mankind, for humanity? And I've been working for the last year with a renewal of what's called the Global Quality Manifesto. It came out of ASQ in 1986. It was renewed in 1996, transformed into something that all the quality organizations in the world agreed to in 2001. It was signed and endorsed by all the major quality organizations at a meeting in Harrogate in the UK, but it is out of date. And the things we have to look at is, what do we have in common? You know, as Kenny said, we all breathe the same air. We basically drink the same water. We have basically the same chemical composition of blood, and our RNA, DNA is very basically the same as a race. And so the things that unite us are actually more than the things that divide us. The things that divide us tend to be the moral codes. But in every society, there are common threads of moral codes. And the point is that we should not impose anything beyond those common threads of moral code on other societies. That doesn't work. So we have to represent the dignity of diversity, and at the same time, understand what is the commonality of human existence.
Okay. Again, I want to apologize to some of you because we're not going to be able to cover all. There's so many questions here. You may email Dr. Watson with your questions if we don't cover them here. Here's one from Naheem. It says, are there any academic programs or standards being developed in the U.S. or elsewhere regarding quality in political systems?
That is a really good question. I can't really say that there are academic institutions that are doing this yet. It's actually just becoming a matter of discussion in the last 2 or 3 years. So no, I can't say that there's a place you can go study or learn about it or read a whole lot about it. At the International Academy for Quality, we wrote a book called Quality Governance, Quality at the Top. It was published by Gold QPC 2007. I wrote that with ASQ honorary member Marcos Bertin, who's been very involved in putting quality into governance through the board of directors. And he works as an advisor to the World Bank, who's actually got a good governance forum to operate. In 2003, the United Nations had a quality and governance conference, which I addressed, and I reported out 2 research reports that were by ASQ on what does it take to create quality governance, and the second was a case study on quality governance of the Treasury Department in the state of Florida, which was the first public financial organization in government to implement SAP to get control of the national finance. But I don't really know of a particular system that's embedding quality in it at this moment. Okay,
so this is a fairly lengthy one here from Robert. He says, okay, I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's important to to kind of cover that off. He says, could we please begin lobbying to have those who wish to enter public office be certified through ASQ and tested on knowledge for the office they want to hold? Again, that sounds like a good idea. There's no vetting of candidates that are being elected to positions. If there was some certification, then this could be revoked if they were not ethical. So that's one point from Robert.
Shall I cover
what do you think about that? Yeah, cover that one.
First of all, I believe there should be a moral code. There are moral codes of ethics which are not followed by government employees. Okay, so that's already a problem. ASQ is not in a position to establish any sort of certification for government. It's a small organization. It does not include all of the conditions that you need for managing government. There are some certifications for board members that are out there. Institute of Directors has one. There's an organization that offers those types of certifications. ASQ actually is too traditionalist in its perspectives. I hold most of the certifications, so I know, that basically it's too traditional and it is not up to date. Quite frankly, I mean, Doug, you're involved with the updating of the Q body of knowledge. These things have a tendency to lock onto the past to settle knowledge, and they do not adapt rapidly to society. So while I agree in principle that there should be some lower threshold limit that's testable, certifiable, we hold people up to professional code of ethics, I don't know what that is.
Okay, and that seems fair. There was another question here regarding, let's see here, where was it? Oh, yes. And this might be a really good one to end on. I'm sorry for those of you who've been asking questions. So Anita asked the question, has Dr. Watson identified a few key metrics that might help measure quality in political policy?
Well, I think yes, actually you can. And one of them is, does the policy endure? Is policy implemented? Is policy followed up? Or is it changed in the process? So just like you can take a look at a new product development and say, is that product any good? One way to take a look at it is the engineering change history after release. A good product doesn't have much of an engineering change history. A bad product has a ton of them because they didn't get it right. They have to keep trying to get it right again. So how many times do the policies of a nation actually stay stable for a long period of time? I think that is perhaps the biggest indicator that we can have in terms of the fact that we don't have quality in government. Because the policies don't stay the same, therefore implementation don't stay the same, funding doesn't stay the same, and we do not have anything consistent. So about the most consistency we have are in federally mandated programs like Social Security or in defense spending.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. All right then. Well, we are running out of time here. We want to make sure that we cover a few closing items here.